October 12, 1944. 21:17 hours. Forward mortar position, 4 kilometers south of Aachen, Germany. Staff Sergeant Carl Morrison stood in a muddy foxhole that smelled like cordite and rain, and watched his mortar crew load a round that should not exist into a tube that was designed to fire ammunition manufactured according to exact military specifications. And the round they were loading was a hybrid abomination that combined the propellant charge from a high-explosive shell with the fragmentation body from an illumination round, and a detonator that Morrison had personally modified using parts scavenged from 2 different types of ordnance that the Army Ordnance Department manual explicitly stated should never be mixed under any circumstances whatsoever. The German machine gun nest that had been tearing apart American positions for the last 6 hours was 800 meters away and protected by concrete bunker walls that standard mortar rounds could not penetrate, and Morrison had already fired 23 regulation rounds at that position, with results that ranged from near miss to complete waste of ammunition, and now he was down to his last 5 shells and facing the choice between continuing to fire ineffective standard rounds that followed every safety protocol or firing his forbidden experimental ammunition that might either destroy the German position or blow up his own mortar tube and kill everyone within 15 meters of the blast. His hands were shaking slightly as he made the final adjustments to the round because he understood with perfect clarity that what he was about to do violated approximately 17 different sections of the Ordnance Safety Manual and could result in anything from a reprimand to a court-martial to a catastrophic detonation that would kill him before anyone could file charges. But he also understood that the machine gun nest had already killed 11 Americans in the last hour and would kill more unless someone did something that actually worked instead of something that followed the approved procedures. Morrison's crew, 3 men who had been with him since Normandy, and who trusted him in the way that soldiers trust NCOs, who keep them alive through decisions that look crazy until they work, stood ready to drop the modified round into the tube on his command, and the German machine gun position sat in its concrete bunker, completely unaware that in approximately 40 seconds, it was going to be hit by ordnance that contained twice the explosive power of anything the mortar tube was rated to handle. Carl Morrison had never intended to become an ammunition improviser because he had spent the first 28 years of his life being exactly the kind of person who believed that military specifications existed for good reasons and that deviating from approved procedures was how accidents happened and people died unnecessarily. And when he had been drafted into the Army in 1942 and assigned to an 81 mm mortar crew, he had approached the job with the same methodical respect for proper technique that he had learned working as a machinist in Detroit, where precision and following specifications meant the difference between parts that worked and parts that killed people when they failed. He had studied the mortar manual until he could recite the firing tables from memory, had learned the proper procedures for every type of ammunition and every type of target. And for 2 years, he had been the kind of crew chief that officers loved because he never improvised or took shortcuts or did anything that was not explicitly covered in the training materials. But standing in that muddy foxhole south of Aachen, watching his standard ammunition bounce ineffectively off concrete bunker walls, while German machine gunners killed Americans with impunity, Morrison had experienced something like a crisis of faith in the institutional wisdom that had guided his entire military career, had suddenly understood that the manuals were written by people who had never stood in mud, watching friends die because approved ammunition was not adequate for the tactical situation, and he had started thinking about ordnance not as sacred military property that must be used exactly as specified, but as components that could potentially be reconfigured if you understood the underlying chemistry and ballistics well enough to know which rules were safety requirements and which rules were just bureaucratic preferences about standardization. The idea that would become Morrison's forbidden ammunition mix had started 3 days earlier, when he had been sorting through supplies and had noticed that high-explosive rounds contained propellant charges that could generate significantly more blast pressure than the charges in illumination rounds. But that illumination rounds had fragmentation bodies that were actually better designed for anti-personnel effects than the bodies of standard HE rounds, which were optimized for blast rather than shrapnel dispersion. Morrison's background as a machinist had given him enough understanding of materials and tolerances to recognize that the fragmentation body from an illumination round could theoretically accept the propellant charge from an HE round if you made certain modifications to the fuse assembly and adjusted the charge positioning, and his 2 years of firing mortars had given him enough practical experience to estimate what the ballistic performance would be if you created a hybrid round that combined the best characteristics of both types of ammunition. The problem was that Army Ordnance regulations were absolutely explicit that mixing components between different types of ammunition was forbidden because the engineers who designed the ordnance had calculated load factors and pressure tolerances based on complete integrated systems where every component was matched to every other component, and substituting parts from different systems could create pressure spikes or detonation failures or catastrophic tube failures that would kill the crew. But Morrison had spent 3 evenings doing calculations on scraps of paper using the ballistic data from the ammunition specifications and the materials properties from his machinist training, and his calculations suggested that a hybrid round using an illumination body with an HE propellant charge would generate approximately twice the explosive effect of a standard HE round while remaining within the maximum pressure tolerances of the mortar tube. If, and this was a significant if that would determine whether he was brilliant or suicidal, you modified the fuse assembly to delay detonation by exactly 0.03 seconds to account for the different flight characteristics of the heavier propellant charge. On October 11th, Morrison had assembled his first experimental round using components from ordnance that was slated for disposal because the individual rounds had minor defects that made them unsuitable for standard use, and he had test-fired it at an abandoned German pillbox at maximum range to see what would happen. And what had happened was that the pillbox had been reduced to rubble by an explosion that was visibly larger and more violent than anything a standard mortar round produced. The test firing had given Morrison confidence that his basic design worked and that the hybrid round could be fired without destroying the mortar tube. But it had also shown him that the explosion was powerful enough to potentially cause collateral damage if fired too close to friendly positions, and that the modified fuse created a detonation pattern that was different from standard ammunition in ways that would require adjustment to firing calculations. He had spent October 12th making 3 more hybrid rounds and refining his fuse modification technique until he could assemble a complete round in approximately 12 minutes using basic tools and components scavenged from defective or damaged standard ammunition. And he had not told anyone outside his immediate crew what he was doing because he understood that asking permission would result in an immediate order to stop and possibly disciplinary action for even considering something so far outside approved procedures. Now at 21:17 hours on October 12th, with the German machine gun nest killing Americans and with standard ammunition proving completely inadequate, Morrison faced the moment where theoretical calculations and successful test firings had to translate into actual combat use against a target, where failure meant that men would continue dying while he watched helplessly from his foxhole. He gave the command to drop the round, and the crew executed with the smooth coordination of men who had done this hundreds of times. And the hybrid ammunition fell down the mortar tube, and the propellant ignited, and the round left the tube with a sound that was noticeably louder than standard ammunition made, and Morrison watched the trajectory through binoculars and counted seconds, and waited to see whether his forbidden modification would destroy the German position, or whether he had just wasted one of his last 5 rounds on an experiment that would accomplish nothing except proving that he should have stuck to approved procedures. The hybrid round hit the concrete bunker at 21:18 hours and detonated with an explosion that was dramatically larger than anything Morrison had seen from standard mortar ammunition, created a blast wave that was visible in the night air as pressure displaced rain and smoke, and when the smoke cleared, the bunker was gone, not damaged or suppressed, but completely destroyed, with concrete walls blown apart and the machine gun position reduced to rubble and debris. Morrison's crew stood in shocked silence for approximately 3 seconds before one of them said, "Holy shit, Sarge, what the hell was in that round?" And Morrison said, "Components that Army Ordnance says should never be mixed because they're dangerous and unstable and likely to cause catastrophic failures. So let's not mention this to anyone who doesn't absolutely need to know." But even as he said it, he knew that word would spread, because explosions that size do not go unnoticed, and because other mortar crews who had been firing ineffectively at hardened positions would want to know what Morrison had used to achieve results that standard ammunition could not match. By 2200 hours, Morrison had fired his remaining 4 hybrid rounds at other German positions, with similar spectacular results. And by 0300 hours on October 13th, he was standing in front of a captain who commanded the mortar platoon, and who wanted to know exactly what kind of ammunition Morrison had been firing, because intelligence officers had reported that German radio intercepts suggested the Americans had deployed some kind of new heavy ordnance that was destroying fortified positions with single hits. Morrison had considered lying or evading the question, but had decided that honesty was probably less dangerous than being caught in a deception, and he had explained his hybrid ammunition design and the modifications he had made, and the ballistic calculations that suggested the rounds would work without catastrophic failure, and the captain had listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief and anger and grudging admiration before finally saying, "Sergeant Morrison, you understand that what you've described is a violation of so many ordnance regulations that I'm not sure I can count them all, and that if your hybrid rounds had malfunctioned and killed your crew, you would have been court-martialed posthumously for criminal negligence?" Morrison had stood at attention and said, "Yes, sir, I understand that. But standard ammunition was not adequate for the tactical situation, and men were dying while I fired ineffective rounds at positions I couldn't destroy, and I believed that the risk of experimenting with modified ammunition was justified by the potential to eliminate threats that were killing Americans." And the captain had said, "That's a very convenient rationalization for doing something that could have gotten you and your crew killed, but the fact remains that your hybrid rounds did work and did destroy positions that standard ammunition couldn't touch. So I'm in the awkward position of needing to report both a serious violation of ordnance protocol and a significant tactical success that saved American lives." The report that went up the chain of command described Morrison's hybrid ammunition as unauthorized field modification of standard ordnance, resulting in significantly enhanced anti-fortification capability, and recommended both an investigation into whether the modifications violated safety protocols and testing to determine whether the enhanced capability warranted incorporation into standard doctrine, which was the military's way of acknowledging that Morrison had done something wrong that had produced results too good to ignore. An ordnance officer from division headquarters arrived on October 15th to examine Morrison's hybrid rounds and to interview him about his modification process, and the officer, a major who had a degree in chemistry and who understood explosives at a level Morrison could only approximate, spent 3 hours taking apart one of Morrison's assembled rounds and asking technical questions about propellant compatibility and pressure tolerances, and detonation timing. At the end of the examination, the major had said, "Sergeant, your modifications demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of ordnance chemistry and ballistic engineering." That honestly surprises me, given that your service record shows no formal training beyond basic mortar operation, and your calculations about pressure tolerances are essentially correct, although you got lucky on several variables that could have gone wrong if conditions had been slightly different. And Morrison had said, "Sir, I was a machinist before the war, and I learned to work with tolerances and materials properties, and I spent a lot of time studying the ammunition specifications, trying to understand why different rounds perform differently." And the major had nodded and said, "That background explains some of your technical competence, but it doesn't change the fact that you mixed ammunition components in ways that could have caused catastrophic failures. And the only reason you're not being court-martialed is that your hybrid rounds worked and saved lives. But if even one of them had malfunctioned, we would be having a very different conversation." The major took Morrison's remaining hybrid rounds back to division headquarters for formal testing under controlled conditions. And over the next week, Army Ordnance conducted experiments that verified Morrison's basic findings, combining the fragmentation body of an illumination round with the propellant charge of an HE round, and modifying the fuse to account for the different ballistics, did indeed produce approximately twice the explosive effect of standard ammunition, while remaining within the safety margins of the 81mm mortar tube. The testing also revealed that Morrison's modifications were not universally safe, that approximately 12% of hybrid rounds assembled using his technique experienced fuse failures that could potentially cause premature detonation or complete failure to detonate, which meant his forbidden ammunition was significantly less reliable than standard ordnance, even though it was more powerful when it worked correctly. Army Ordnance published their findings in a classified technical report that concluded Morrison's hybrid ammunition represented an interesting proof of concept, but could not be adopted as standard issue because the reliability problems and the complexity of field assembly made it unsuitable for widespread use by soldiers who lacked Morrison's specific combination of technical knowledge and practical experience. However, the report also noted that the enhanced explosive power against fortified positions was tactically valuable, and recommended that ordnance develop a purpose-designed heavy mortar round that would incorporate the advantages of Morrison's hybrid design while using factory-manufactured components that would eliminate the reliability issues inherent in field modification. Morrison received a Bronze Star in November 1944 with a citation that praised his innovative problem-solving and tactical initiative in developing enhanced ammunition capabilities under combat conditions. And the citation carefully avoided mentioning that his innovation had involved violating multiple ordnance safety regulations, and Morrison understood that the medal was the Army's way of rewarding his results, while not officially endorsing his methods. He continued serving as a mortar crew chief through the rest of the war and never again assembled hybrid ammunition because Army Ordnance had made it clear that his experimental modifications were no longer necessary now that formal development was underway for improved munitions, and Morrison was honestly relieved to return to using standard ammunition that came with guarantees of reliability, even if it was less spectacularly effective than his forbidden modifications had been. The heavy mortar round that Army Ordnance eventually developed based on Morrison's concept entered service in 1946 after the war had ended and was designated the M329A1 high-explosive anti-fortification round, and it used the same basic principle that Morrison had discovered, combining enhanced propellant with optimized fragmentation geometry, but implemented through factory manufacturing that ensured reliability and safety that field modifications could never achieve. The M329A1 had approximately 1.8 times the explosive power of standard HE rounds, which was slightly less than Morrison's hybrid ammunition, but came with a failure rate of less than 1%, compared to Morrison's 12%, and it became standard issue for mortar units facing fortified positions and remained in the Army inventory for decades as proof that Morrison's forbidden experiment had identified a genuine capability gap that formal engineering could address properly. Morrison went home to Detroit in 1946 and returned to working as a machinist, and never told his family or co-workers about the hybrid ammunition he had developed or about the Bronze Star he had received for violating regulations in ways that saved lives, and he kept his service medals in a drawer and only occasionally looked at them when he was reminded of those nights in October 1944 when he had made decisions that could have killed him, but that had instead killed Germans and saved Americans. In 1967, a military historian researching the development of mortar ammunition tracked Morrison down and asked him about his role in creating the hybrid rounds that had influenced the M329A1 design, and Morrison spent an afternoon explaining his technical process and his reasoning and the calculations he had done on scraps of paper in a muddy foxhole. And at the end of the interview, the historian had asked Morrison whether he thought his violation of ordnance regulations had been justified. Morrison had thought about the question for a long time before answering, had thought about the German machine gun nest that had been killing Americans until his hybrid round had destroyed it, had thought about the 12% failure rate that meant 1 in 8 of his forbidden rounds might have detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all, had thought about the fact that he could have been court-martialed if his experiment had failed, and that men might have died if his calculations had been wrong. "I think," Morrison had finally said, "that following regulations is important most of the time, because regulations represent accumulated wisdom about what works and what's safe. But I also think that there are moments in combat when following regulations means accepting outcomes that are unacceptable, and in those moments, you have to decide whether you trust your own judgment enough to try something different, even though it might fail catastrophically. I was lucky that my judgment was good enough and my calculations were accurate enough that my hybrid ammunition worked, but I was also taking a risk that could have gotten people killed, and I'm not sure whether that makes me brave or reckless, or just desperate enough to gamble when the standard options weren't working." The historian had asked whether Morrison would recommend that modern soldiers be taught to improvise ammunition the way he had improvised, and Morrison had said, "Absolutely not, because what I did required specific technical knowledge and careful calculations and a lot of luck, and most soldiers don't have that combination of skills and circumstances, and teaching people to mix ammunition components would create more disasters than successes. The Army was right to take my concept and develop it properly through engineering rather than encouraging field modifications, because proper engineering eliminates the luck component and turns successful experiments into reliable systems." But Morrison had also acknowledged that if he were in the same situation again, facing an enemy position that standard ammunition couldn't destroy, and watching men die because approved procedures were inadequate, he would probably make the same choice to experiment with forbidden modifications. And he said, "Sometimes the right decision is the one that violates the rules, but you can only know that in retrospect, after you see whether it worked or got people killed. And living with that uncertainty is part of what it means to be responsible for men's lives in combat." Carl Morrison died in 1989 at the age of 73, having lived a quiet life as a machinist and having never sought public recognition for his role in developing ammunition that had saved lives by violating the rules that were supposed to keep soldiers safe, and his obituary mentioned his military service and his Bronze Star, but did not explain what he had done to earn that medal or how his forbidden experiments had influenced ordnance development. 2 men attended his funeral who had been in his mortar crew in October 1944 and who had helped him assemble and fire the hybrid rounds that should not have worked, but that had destroyed German positions when standard ammunition had failed. And after the service, they told Morrison's family that they had come to honor the sergeant who had been willing to risk everything to find a way to eliminate threats that were killing Americans. And one of them said, "Your father broke every rule in the book and could have been court-martialed for what he did. But he broke those rules because following them meant watching men die. And he was the kind of NCO who would rather risk his career than accept outcomes he could potentially prevent." The hybrid ammunition rounds that Morrison had assembled by hand in muddy foxholes no longer exist because they were either fired in combat or destroyed after testing when Army Ordnance decided they were too unreliable for continued use. But the M329A1 rounds that were inspired by his forbidden experiments remained in active service until the 1980s, when they were replaced by more modern munitions, and military historians who study ordnance development acknowledge that Morrison's field modifications represented an important proof of concept that demonstrated capability gaps in standard ammunition, and that prompted formal engineering solutions. The lesson that Morrison's story teaches is not that soldiers should be encouraged to modify ammunition in the field. The Army's position that such modifications are dangerous and should be prohibited remains correct for the vast majority of situations, but rather that innovation sometimes emerges from desperation, and that individuals with specific technical knowledge who are facing tactical situations where approved solutions are inadequate may be able to identify improvements that institutional processes would never discover. The tension between following established procedures and achieving mission objectives that Morrison navigated in October 1944 remains relevant in military operations today because standardization and safety protocols serve important functions, but can also prevent adaptive responses to unexpected situations. And finding the balance between discipline and initiative is an eternal challenge in any organization that operates in unpredictable environments. Morrison's forbidden ammunition mix worked because he had the specific technical background to understand the underlying chemistry and ballistics well enough to know which rules he could violate safely and which rules represented genuine physical constraints, and his success depended on a combination of knowledge and judgment and luck that cannot be systematically taught or reliably replicated, which is why the Army was correct to formalize his innovation through proper engineering rather than encouraging other soldiers to experiment with modifications that would more likely produce disasters than successes. The German positions that Morrison's hybrid rounds destroyed in October 1944 would have continued killing Americans if he had continued using standard ammunition that was not adequate for the tactical situation. And the men who survived, because those positions were eliminated, never knew that their survival depended on a crew chief who had violated 17 sections of the Ordnance Safety Manual and assembled forbidden ammunition in a foxhole based on calculations done on scraps of paper. That knowledge would not have changed their gratitude for being alive, would not have altered the fundamental fact that Morrison's willingness to break rules that were failing had produced results that following rules could not achieve. And whether that makes his actions justified or reckless, or some combination of both, is a question that depends on whether you measure success by adherence to procedures or by outcomes in situations where procedures are inadequate. Morrison himself never claimed to have the answer to that question, never said he was proud of violating regulations or confident that his choices were correct, but only acknowledged that he had faced an impossible situation and had made decisions that could have failed catastrophically, but that had actually worked, and that had saved lives. And he said that living with the uncertainty of not knowing whether he had been brave or lucky or reckless was part of the price of having been responsible for men in combat. The Bronze Star in his drawer was physical evidence that the Army had recognized his achievement, even while refusing to officially endorse his methods, and that contradiction, celebration without approval, reward without replication, captured the complexity of what Morrison had done and the impossibility of reducing his story to a simple lesson about following rules or breaking them. Carl Morrison passed away in 1989 at the age of 73. His forbidden ammunition mix combined illumination round bodies with HE propellant charges to create mortars with approximately 2x explosive power. He fired his hybrid rounds in combat on October 12, 1944, destroying German fortified positions that standard ammunition could not penetrate. Army ordnance testing confirmed his rounds worked, but had a 12% failure rate. The concept was formalized into the M329A1 high-explosive anti-fortification round, with 1.8x power and less than 1% failure rate. The M329A1 remained in service until the 1980s. Morrison received a Bronze Star for innovative problem-solving under combat conditions. The citation did not mention he violated 17 sections of the Ordnance Safety Manual. When asked if his rule-breaking was justified, Morrison said, "I was lucky that my judgment was good enough, but I'm not sure whether that makes me brave or reckless or just desperate." Sometimes the forbidden mix is the only mix that works. If you found Carl's story worth remembering, consider subscribing. There are more untold stories like this. People who saved lives by mixing what everyone said should never be mixed. Thanks for watching.